Welcome to Architecture 360 on Rivet. I'm Lee Bay. You may not know the architect, but you do know his buildings. The silvery blade-like Swiss Hotel on Wacker Drive near Columbus. Or how about the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the skyscraper federal jail downtown? Or the former Time Life building, a near-golden modernist skyscraper at 541 North Fairbanks. And if you make it out to the nation's capital, the entire Washington, D.C. metro system. All the work of architect Harry Weese. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Weese's birth, and unlike other architects who found success and fame in mid-20th century Chicago, we're talking about folks like Mies van der Rohe, Bruce Graham of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and Bertrand Goldberg. Weese, who died in 1998, is somewhat forgotten today. But without him, Chicago would look quite different. In addition to the aforementioned buildings, without Weese, there would likely be no Printers Row. The auditorium building could have been demolished, and Navy Pier might not be the tourist attraction it is today. Architecture critic Lynn Becker has been doing a lot of thinking lately about Weese and his legacy. Becker writes the blog Architecture Chicago Plus. Lynn, thank you for joining us. Now, let me just begin by asking, why should we pay attention to Weese and his work?
Well, I think that he's one of the overlooked masters of Chicago architecture. You know, most of the modernism in Chicago came through like France, Le Corbusier, or through Germany with the sort of industrial architecture that Behrens did, which became the architecture that Mies did. Weese was more influenced by the modernists in Scandinavia, people like Alvar Aalto. So it's much more of a humanist kind of outlook on it. So he looked at things a different way. He was not only was he a really good architect, he was also a major planner. And he also was a major real estate developer, which is sort of a problem for him eventually. But
you know, his ability, let's talk, we'll talk about the architecture, but let's talk about his ability to see things as a planner. Really uncanny. I mean, when Navy Pier, for instance, was just a ramshackle thing there, he saw what we'd see today, a thing with a Ferris wheel and sort of a citywide kind of attraction. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think he was able to see the big picture from above, and maybe the literal expression of that is the story is that one day he was flying into Midway or into O'Hare, and the plane comes over the South Loop, and he looks down at this huge, tall, thin building on the near south side, which was a transportation building, which was basically an abandoned building. Mm-hmm. And he said to himself, you know, why couldn't we have people live here? And he paired up with other people, and he created basically what we call Printers Row, which was one of the first cases where you basically took all these industrial lofts, which very slowly were losing their usability because industry was moving elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And he said, let's make these residential. Let's make these unneeded communities into residential communities. And now you go around, this is what's happening in Fulton Market, this is what's happening everywhere, these kind of loft conversions. And he was one of the first ones to see the potential of that.
Radical in today, I mean, it's something that you did in Soho back then maybe, but not here in Chicago.
Not
the building
Chicago.
Outlived its usefulness, you just tore it down, or you just
let it to rot.
Exactly. And so he foresaw Printers Row, Navy Pier, as we just talked about. He also helped save the Auditorium Theater, as I recall.
Yeah, the story was that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, very powerful architecture firm, told Roosevelt University, who had bought the auditorium building, saying, you know, this thing is falling apart. Give it to us. We'll build you a beautiful modern theater inside this space. So because Harry Weese was so instrumental about knowing the importance of this space, that's why one of the major reasons, he had help in terms of raising funds, but that's one of the reasons why one of the glories of Chicago architecture is still here today.
And now let's do a quick roll call of his work. I mean, we think about the Metropolitan Correction Center, this triangular-shaped jail down there, which is actually, you know, given how jails usually turn out, I mean, it's actually a pretty cool building. The Swiss Hotel, right, on Wacker Drive, which has a similar kind of nautical shape. That's a theme of his a bit. Talk about more buildings of his that we might see. Well,
if you know the 17th Church of Christ Scientist, which is on Wabash, it's a round building. The interior is spectacular. That is another one of his that really... And then you scale down to the small stuff. Near the end of his career, there are a couple of things he did. There used to be an old cold storage warehouse on the river. I remember as a kid going by. And it had this huge 12-story Old Forester bourbon sign on it. He took that building, which no longer was needed, and converted it into condos. And next to it, he built these series of river cottages, which are small, charming buildings. Originally, he was going to build buildings all the way up the river. Those are the only two who got done. That got done, but those were also both really amazing developments of his. If you go to Washington, D.C., one of the most spectacular and successful subway designs, especially if you compare it to what we did in Chicago initially, is the D.C. Metro, which has all these amazing concrete vaults. So it has this very spacious feel to it. That's Harry Weese.
Now, what's the theme that runs through his architecture? I mean, at least when we think about, let's say, Mises' architecture, Mies van der Rohe's architecture, we talk about a sort of rationality, a sort of mathematic sense of how things fit together. What's to take away from Weese's work?
He was more modest. He was sort of a conservative radical, but he was very much progressive in his design. Mm-hmm. So he sort of was plotting a middle way, which I think was heavily influenced again by the Scandinavians, that really says there isn't one answer. So whereas the Mies was very much like, let's wipe all the corruption clean and start all over again. Weese was, as we've just said, was a preservationist. He knew the importance of saving old buildings. He knew the importance of the fabric of urban architecture where it's not all one thing.
Personally, he was a complicated man.
He was very much almost like a Cheever-esque figure because he was born to a wealthy family. Everyone who knew him, which I didn't, found him enormously charming. But he had his own inner demons. And he could be, especially as he got later in his life, he became very abrasive in some circumstances. He became difficult to work with. There was an intervention for alcoholism. So, yes, I think, it's almost like the Richard Corey thing. If you're that charming, people think that it just comes natural, but I think it's a lot of work to be charming all the time. So there's a lot of pressure on you.
And then he dies in the 90s, am I right, at a veterans facility in Manteno, which is like not the way you would think.
Well, I think he also suffered from Alzheimer's, what we would call Alzheimer's today, towards the end. But it became more difficult because, like, one of the last things he did, he worked very hard in the early 1990s to get a World's Fair for Chicago.
Talk about that a bit. This is one of my favorite stories, by the way.
And he brought in all his planning skills. He laid it out along the lakefront. And it was also sort of like at the end point of the great World's Fairs. That was sort of like going away because we really haven't had things at that scale.
At the point he died, his high point of his career was kind of behind him a bit. And then is it fair to say that he was sort of, I don't want to say forgotten, but kind of in a way. But now it seems like there are more people talking about him these days.
Well, I'd like to see that. I mean, the really interesting thing is that in this his 100th year, there are no exhibitions. There are no major events that I'm aware of to commemorate this. I think Chicago right now is all sort of caught up. All the architectural oxygen in Chicago has sort of like been sucked up by the biennial, which is taking place this fall.
Exactly. This is so that people may not know this. This is the first of what's going to be 2-year fairs, similar to the Venice Biennale, but themed around architecture that'll happen here. And you're absolutely right. There is no mention of Weese, to my knowledge, in this, which is an irony, given that the purpose of this is to celebrate Chicago architecture, celebrate Chicago solving problems. Here's a guy who was doing it 50 years ago. He should have a place here.
Not much more than 20 years ago he was still active. It's not like he's from some distant past.
True.
He's fallen into this sort of a hole where, like Sullivan fell into, where he's out of fashion and he's not old enough to be rediscovered, apparently. I would recommend to your listeners, there's a great book that Bob Brugman did like 5 years ago called The Architecture of Harry Weese. And it's really an essential book, not just if you're interested in Harry Weese, but if you're interested in Chicago architecture.
Lynn Becker, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to Architecture 360 on Rivet. Check me out on Facebook at Lee Bay Chicago and follow me on Twitter under my name, Lee Bay. Join me next time.